You've probably seen the photographs. The blue so deep it looks painted on. Houseboats drifting between walls of red sandstone. Families jumping off the back deck into water that goes down and down and down into a pool that never quite touches the desert heat above it. Lake Powell, second largest reservoir in the United States. Nearly 200 miles of drowned canyon dressed up as a playground. Sold on postcards, printed on brochures, remembered fondly by everyone who ever spent a summer there. Nobody puts the other part in the brochures. Nobody tells you that the beauty you're floating on top of is a lid. Because as the water dropped, and it has dropped further and faster than the people who built this place ever thought possible, something started to come back up. Not a creature, not a shipwreck, not some tourist legend the marina staff whisper about after dark. Something older than all of that. Something quieter. Something that was deliberately drowned 60 years ago because a handful of people decided the rest of us were never supposed to see it again. And here's the thing I want you to sit with before we go any further. Once you understand what's emerging from that water, you will never look at those postcard photographs the same way. Lake Powell will be ruined for you in the way it's been ruined for me, because you'll know what's underneath. So let me take you down there. Not all at once. That's not how this works. We're going to descend the way the water is descending, one level at a time, and I promise you every single layer is worse than the one above it. Do me a favor and stay with me to the bottom, because the bottom is where the real story is. And the bottom is the part almost nobody's talking about out loud. Let's start with what this place actually is, because you can't understand what's coming back until you understand what was buried. In 1963, engineers finished a wall of concrete 710 foot tall and wedged it into a narrow throat of rock on the Utah and Arizona border. Glen Canyon Dam. They closed the gates, and the Colorado River, which had been carving through that sandstone for millions of years, patient, relentless, indifferent, suddenly had nowhere to go. So it did the only thing water does when you stop it. It backed up. It rose, filled. It climbed the canyon walls foot by foot, month by month, spreading its cold fingers into every side crevice, every hidden chamber, every quiet alcove where the light used to fall in a very particular way at a very particular hour. And when it was done rising, it had created the second largest reservoir in America by capacity. At full pool, it holds around 26 million acre-feet of water, a number so large it stops meaning anything. Backing up nearly 200 miles of canyon and feeding taps, farms, and power lines for more than 40 million people across the American Southwest. That's the version you know. That's the good version. That's the version on the brochure. But hold that number in your head, full pool, because the entire story I am about to tell you lives in the gap between that number and what is actually in there today. In 1999, Lake Powell sat almost exactly where its builders wanted it. The surface hovered near 3,700 feet in elevation, practically brimming. The houseboats had all the water they could want. The turbines inside the dam were spinning at full power, and if you had told anyone standing on that dam back then that the lake was about to lose a third of itself, they would have laughed you off the observation deck. But water does not care what we assume. By April of 2023, that same surface had dropped to around 3,520 feet. Do the math, and that is roughly 180 feet of water gone, vanished into the sky, into the sandstone, into the demands of 40 million people, and a river that was never as generous as the paperwork claimed. 180 vertical feet. Try to picture that against the wall of a canyon. Picture the old high water line, that pale bleached stripe they call the bathtub ring, sitting 180 feet above where you are standing on the mud. That's how far the lid slid open. And here's the part that should make the back of your neck go cold. At 3,520 feet, Lake Powell was sitting just about 30 feet above a line engineers have a very quiet, very ugly name for. They call it Dead Pool. Below roughly 3,490 feet of elevation, there is not enough water stacked up behind that dam to physically push through the outlets anymore. The dam stops being a dam. The whole system, the water for the cities, the power for the grid, just stops. 30 feet. That's the margin. That's how close a machine that serves 40 million people came to becoming nothing but a wall. Now, most people, when they hear those numbers, they think about the water going away. That's the natural fear. Not enough water. But that is not the story I am here to tell you, because the far stranger, far quieter horror is not what is leaving. It is what is arriving. Because every single foot that the water drops, the canyon that was drowned in 1963 comes back. And it does not come back clean. It does not come back the way it went down. It comes back with everything that was sealed inside it for 60 years, and I mean everything. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what was actually in that canyon before the gates closed. And this is where most people's knowledge just stops, because they never knew there was a before. They think Lake Powell was always a lake. It wasn't. Before it was a reservoir, Glen Canyon was one of the most extraordinary landscapes in the entire American West. And I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I'm saying it because the people who actually saw it, the small number of people who ever got the chance, spent the rest of their lives haunted by it. This was a place you could only reach by boat. A river running through a maze of red rock, threading past hundreds of hidden side canyons, each one a doorway into somewhere the sun barely reached. You'd drift down the main channel, and a slot would open in the wall no wider than a hallway. And if you nosed your boat into it and followed the water back and back through the cool shadow, the walls would suddenly soar and curve and close overhead into these vast natural chambers of sandstone. People who walked into them didn't have a scientific word for what they felt, so they reached for the only word that fit. They called them cathedrals, and there was one that outranked them all. One that people who spent their whole lives on that river spoke about in the kind of hushed voice you'd use in an actual church. It sat back in a place called Clear Creek Canyon, and everyone who ever stood inside it called it the cathedral in the desert. Picture this. You leave the main river, you follow a narrow thread of water back into the rock, and the canyon keeps closing tighter and tighter above you until the sky is just a ribbon. And then, without warning, the walls sweep outward into an enormous curved amphitheater carved by 10,000 years of falling water. The sandstone streaked in bands of rust and honey and deep bruised red. At the far end, a waterfall spilled from a lip high above, dropping into a clear green pool at the bottom. And the acoustics. Everyone talks about the acoustics. You could speak in a normal voice and the whole chamber would answer you. A single word came back layered, softened, returned to you from every direction at once. Like the rock itself was listening and repeating it. Almost nobody on Earth ever saw it. Before the 1950s, you could count the visitors in the dozens. And by the middle of the 1960s, it was gone. 300 foot underwater, silent, drowned in the dark with the fish swimming through a space that used to ring like a bell. So, how does a place like that just vanish? How does one of the most beautiful natural wonders in North America get erased and almost no one raise a hand to stop it? That's the part of the story that keeps me up at night, because the answer isn't an accident. It was a trade, a deliberate, calculated trade, and the man who made it spent the rest of his life describing it as the single greatest mistake he ever made. Back in the 1950s, there was a plan to build a dam in a place called Echo Park up inside Dinosaur National Monument, and the conservation movement of that era, led by a fierce, brilliant man who ran the Sierra Club, fought that dam with everything they had. Rallies, testimony, books, a national campaign, and they won. They beat the dam at Echo Park. It was a landmark victory, the moment the modern environmental movement really found its teeth. But nothing in this world comes for free. To kill the dam at Echo Park, they had to give the engineers something. They had to point at the map and in effect say, not there, here. And the place they pointed at was Glen Canyon. Here's the terrible logic of it. Echo Park was inside a national monument. It had a name people recognized. It had defenders. Glen Canyon had none of those things. It was remote, unmapped in the public imagination, reachable only by people willing to spend days on a boat. It had no organized constituency, no postcards, no fame. Almost nobody had heard of it, which meant almost nobody would miss it. So, on paper, in a conference room, Glen Canyon looked like the safe thing to sacrifice. The empty square on the board you give up to save the king. Except it wasn't empty. It was one of the richest, strangest, most sacred landscapes on the continent. And the men trading it away had, most of them, never even seen it. That's the horror of it. They drowned a cathedral they'd never walked into to save a canyon they had. And the man who led that fight, he understood far too late exactly what he'd done. He went down the river before the gates closed. He finally saw the place he'd bargained away, and he came back changed. For the rest of his life, he called the loss of Glen Canyon the biggest single mistake, the deepest regret of the entire American conservation movement. He'd won the battle everyone remembers, and in doing it, he'd lost the war nobody knew was being fought. There was one last attempt to make people understand what was disappearing, and it's one of the most quietly devastating things I've ever come across. A photographer went down into Glen Canyon in its final years before the water came, and he documented it. Not the grand postcard shots, the intimate ones. Light bending off the wet sandstone. Ferns growing out of a seep in the rock. The green of the water in a hidden pool. Reflections that looked like something out of a dream. And the Sierra Club took those photographs and published them in a book in 1963, the exact year the gates closed and the flooding began. And they gave that book a title that wasn't hopeful, wasn't celebratory. It was bitter. It was almost an accusation. They called it The Place No One Knew. Think about the cruelty and the honesty of that title. This is a book of photographs of a place, and its title is telling you straight to your face that by the time you're holding it, you can never go there. These are pictures of a room that no longer exists. Every image is a photograph of a ghost. The book wasn't meant to make you want to visit. It was meant to make you grieve for something you never even knew you'd lost. To make you feel the weight of a door closing on a place that most of the country never learned was open in the first place. And it worked. For decades, that book was the only way most people would ever see Glen Canyon, through the eyes of a man who watched it drown. But the photographs weren't the only thing in that canyon that the water was about to swallow. Because Glen Canyon wasn't just beautiful rock and hidden waterfalls. It was one of the most important archaeological landscapes in the American Southwest. And the people who lived there left behind a record going back 1,000 1,000 years. Cliff dwellings tucked into alcoves in the sandstone. Granaries where they stored corn, still sealed, still standing. Rock art carved and painted onto the walls. Hundreds of sites. Hundreds. And in the years right before the flood, the federal government sent in teams to do what they grimly called salvage archaeology. A race against the rising water. But the canyon was 200 miles long and the clock was already running. And there was no version of that job that could ever have been finished in time. And what they couldn't reach in time, the water took anyway. Picture what that actually meant on the ground. A handful of archaeologists working in brutal desert heat, hiking into side canyons that took a full day to reach on foot, trying to catalog 1,000 years of human life before a wall of water erased it. They had cameras, notebooks, measuring tapes, and a deadline that wasn't set by science or by care. It was set by concrete, by the rate at which the reservoir was filling behind Glen Canyon Dam. Every week the water climbed higher, and every week another cluster of sites that someone had planned to document simply vanished under the surface before anyone got to them. And here's the part that stays with me. They knew they were losing. They knew walking in that they could not possibly reach everything. So they made choices. Tria. Which sites do we record and which do we abandon to the water because there isn't time? Imagine standing in front of a cliff dwelling that a family built and lived in and raised children in 800 years ago, knowing you have to walk past it because there's a more accessible one downstream that you can actually finish before the flood reaches it. That happened over and over. And the sites they walked past, the ones the water took undocumented, we don't have records of them because there was never time to make records. They didn't fail to survive history. They failed to survive a schedule. Some of what they did manage to save is genuine. Photographs, field notes, artifacts moved to museums. But even the salvage crews would tell you it was a fraction. The canyon was too big, the timeline too short, and the men making the decisions in offices far away had already decided that the water mattered more than the record. So, 1,000 years of the ancestral Puebloan world went under the surface of a lake named after a one-armed explorer. And most of it was never seen by trained eyes at all. It was just there one season and gone the next, sealed under 300 feet of green water where no one would ever walk again. Or so everyone assumed, because for 40 years that assumption held. The lake stayed high. The dam did its job. The water covered the canyon, the dwellings, the granaries, the rock art, the cathedral, the ferns, the whole drowned world, and the country moved on. Tourists came. Houseboats floated over side canyons 100 feet above the roofs of ruins. They'd never know were beneath them. Water skiers cut across the surface above the exact spot where that waterfall used to fall into that pool with the impossible acoustics. And nobody thought about any of it because you can't grieve for a place you can't see. And the water made sure no one could see. But nature keeps its own books. And the numbers that mattered weren't the tourism numbers or the recreation numbers. They were the water numbers. And the water numbers were beginning to tell a story that the people who built this whole system had never planned for. Because here's what I need you to understand. And it's the thing that changes everything about how you look at Lake Powell. The decline of this reservoir is not at its heart a story about drought. Drought is real, and drought is making it worse. And I'll get to that. But the deeper problem was baked into the system before the first bucket of concrete was ever poured. It goes back to 1922 to an agreement called the Colorado River Compact. 7 states sat down to divide up the river between them, upper basin and lower basin. And they divided it based on how much water they believed the river carried. And here's the catastrophe hiding inside that meeting. The years they used to measure the river's flow happened to be some of the wettest years the river had seen in a very long time. They looked at a river swollen fat with unusual abundance, and they wrote that abundance into law as if it were normal. They promised more water on paper than the river has ever reliably delivered. Think about that. The entire legal architecture of water in the American Southwest, the promises that 40 million people depend on, is built on a measurement taken during a fluke. They divided a pie that was bigger than the pie that actually exists. And for a while, when the reservoirs were full and the snowpack was heavy, nobody had to confront the math. There was enough slack in the system to paper over the lie. But you can't outrun arithmetic forever. Every year, the states drew their full legal shares out of a river that couldn't refill them. And the reservoirs, Powell and Meade, the 2 great bank accounts of the Colorado, quietly, steadily began to empty. And then the drought came and put its thumb on the scale. Not an ordinary dry spell. A researcher analyzing tree rings and climate records published findings in a scientific journal in 2022 that placed the dry period beginning around the year 2000 as the most severe drought this region has endured in at least 1,200 years. 12 centuries. Not since before the ancestral Puebloans built those dwellings in Glen Canyon has the Southwest been this dry for this long. And that same study concluded that a significant share of that severity, roughly 42% of it, could be traced directly to human-caused climate change. So it isn't just bad luck. We didn't just draw a dry hand. We tilted the table, put the overdrawn compact and the 1,200-year drought together, and you don't get a temporary dip. You get get structural decline. A reservoir that was designed for a river that no longer exists drying up according to a math problem written a century ago. And as it dries, the water peels back off the sandstone foot by foot, year by year, and the drowned world begins to surface. But before I show you what came back up, and before I tell you how close this dam is to becoming nothing but a wall, you need to understand exactly what happens at the bottom. Because there is a number, a specific elevation, that changes everything the moment the water touches it. That number is 3,490 feet. Say it out loud, because engineers in the Southwest say it the way people say a diagnosis. At full pool, Lake Powell sits near 3,700 feet. In 2023, it dropped to around 3,520. Do the subtraction and you land on a terrifying margin, barely 30 feet of water standing between this system working and this system failing. And 3,490 is where the failure lives. They call it dead pool. Here is what dead pool actually means, and it's stranger and worse than it sounds. Glen Canyon Dam doesn't just hold water back, pushes water through. Deep inside its concrete, there are outlets and turbines, and the entire mechanism depends on pressure, on having enough water stacked up behind the wall to force it down and out through the pipes. That downward force has a name, hydraulic head, and it's the hydraulic head that moves the whole river. When the lake falls below 3,490, that muscle simply isn't there anymore. There isn't enough water above the outlets to push anything through them. The pipes are there, and the turbines, more than 1,300 megawatts of generating capacity, enough to light up cities across the region, go to zero. Not reduced, zero. The power that millions of people quietly rely on every time they flip a switch just stops coming out of that canyon. That's what a single number does. 30 feet of water is the difference between a working dam and a monument to a plan that failed. But here's the part that keeps water managers awake, and I want you to hold it in your mind because it's the reason this isn't one crisis, but two. Lake Mead, the other great reservoir, the one behind Hoover Dam, the one that serves Las Vegas and Phoenix and Los Angeles, gets most of its water from Glen Canyon's releases. Powell fills Mead. So, if Powell drops so low it can no longer release water downstream, Mead doesn't just decline. Mead falls off a cliff. The crisis at one instantly becomes the crisis at both. Two dams, two dead pools, tied together like climbers on the same rope. When one goes over the edge, it drags the other after it. And that is the machinery of collapse humming just beneath the surface as the water keeps peeling back. Which brings us, finally, to what has been emerging. Because as terrifying as the numbers are, the thing rising out of that receding water is not a horror. It's a resurrection. In 2022 and 2023, as the lake bottomed out, the cathedral in the desert came back more fully than it had in half a century. The photographer who documented Glen Canyon before the flooding, the man whose bitter beautiful book showed people a paradise the same month the gates closed and stole it. He had photographed a waterfall in that chamber back in 1962. And in 2023, that waterfall flowed again. People floated into that hidden amphitheater carrying his old book, holding the photographs up against the living rock, and they matched. The place no one was ever supposed to see again was letting people in. Downstream, the rapids of Cataract Canyon, long drowned and silenced, began to roar back to life as the river reclaimed its old character. The drowned world was breathing again. Now, some people look at that and say, then let it come back. There's a proposal. It has been around since the 1990s, dismissed for years as a fantasy, arguing we should stop trying to keep two half-empty reservoirs and consolidate what water we have into Mead alone, letting Powell drain. Their argument is brutally simple. Two reservoirs lose around 1 million acre-feet every year just to evaporation off all that exposed surface. And Powell loses even more because the sandstone it sits in is porous. The canyon literally drinks the reservoir, seeping water into the rock. Why? They ask. Run two leaking buckets when you could run one? For decades, that idea was unthinkable. As Deadpool creeps closer, it's starting to sound less like a fantasy and more like a plan. But there's a complication buried in the mud, and it's a big one. Since 1963, that dam has been trapping sediment, millions of tons a year, silt that used to flow down and feed the Grand Canyon below. That trapped sediment costs the reservoir something like 100,000 acre-feet of storage every single year. And it means that if Powell drains, the canyon that returns won't be the pristine one that was flooded. Some of those side canyons will be partly choked with 60 years of accumulated silt. The resurrection won't be perfect. And yet, that same released sediment, flowing again for the first time in generations, could begin to heal a Grand Canyon that has been starved of it, rebuilding beaches and habitat downstream. Even the damage carries a strange mercy. And through all of this, I keep coming back to the people who were never asked. The tribal nations whose ancestors built in that canyon were informed the flooding would happen. Not consulted, not partners, just notified. And as recently as 2023, a Supreme Court ruling left the Navajo Nation without secure rights to the very water everyone else has been fighting over for a century. The people with the oldest claim to that river still stand at the back of the line. So here is where we actually are. The choice isn't really refill or drain because the climate climate projections make refilling unlikely, no matter what we decide. The choice is whether we plan for a post-Powell river with our eyes open or whether we let it happen to us. Because the canyon is coming back either way. Not because of policy, because of physics. The water is leaving and the drowned cathedral is rising, and no law written in a wet year music a century ago can hold it under. So, here's what I want to know from you. If we truly can't refill it, if the river simply won't deliver the water we promised ourselves, would you fight to keep Lake Powell as the reservoir we've known, or would you let Glen Canyon come all the way back, silt and scars and all, and try to live with the river as it actually is? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one.